rice has come to Japan, and with it, a side of war. Join me today on the second episode of Japanese History, the Textbook, as we discuss the Yayoi period and trace the footsteps of the Japanese people as they move from the idyllic Jomon period into a bloody era of kings, queens, and conquests on the Buyuden Japanese History channel. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Japanese History, the Textbook, the series where we make our way through the history of Japan using educational materials made for Japanese public school students as our guide. If you would like further background on the premise for this series, please feel free to check out episode 1, where I go into some detail on the concept behind these videos. But for everyone else, let's get right into it. Japanese History, the Textbook, Episode 2, the Yayoi Period. Conventionally, the period between the end of the Jomon period around the 5th or 4th century BC and the beginning of the Kofun period at the end of the 3rd century CE is known as the Yayoi period, and that era's culture is referred to as Yayoi culture. Perhaps the most significant feature of the Yayoi period is the introduction of rice cultivation, inasaku, to Japan. As mentioned in the previous episode, the people who newly migrated to Japan around this time are known to historians as the Yayoi people, and they were ethnically distinct from the Jomon people who were already residing on the island. The Yayoi people's genetic makeup places their roots in the northern part of the Asian continent, and they are also sometimes called Neo-Mongoloids, but we can practically think of them as people who migrated to Japan from China and Korea. These people brought the practice and technology of rice farming with them when they came to Japan at the end of the Jomon period. It initially took root in the northern part of the island of Kyushu, but before long it had begun to spread widely across the Japanese archipelago. This transmission of the rice farming technology was long thought to have occurred in the 4th century BC, but archaeological finds in the 1970s and 80s showed that its arrival may in fact have been about a century earlier, placing the start of the Yayoi period in the 5th century BC. Furthermore, research conducted by the National Museum of Japanese History in 2003 employed radiocarbon dating techniques to arrive at the conclusion that rice cultivation in Japan may have actually begun as early as the 10th century BC. This is the same time that it came to the Korean peninsula, and this date of the 10th century BC is beginning to become accepted as the true start of the Yayoi period. Either way, the beginning of the Yayoi period goes hand in hand with the beginning of rice cultivation in Japan, whenever that may have actually occurred. With the lifestyle revolution brought on by this new technology, people began to live more in lowland areas that were suited to farming, and the remains of early rice paddies have been found in places such as the Itazuke site in Fukuoka Prefecture, the Toro site in Shizuoka Prefecture, and the Karakokagi site in Nara Prefecture. They tilled the land with wooden hoes and plows, wore platformed tageta sandals while walking through the paddies sprinkling unhulled seed rice, and used stone knives, ishibocho, to harvest the full-grown rice. They then stored the harvested rice in raised warehouses called takayuka soko. Along with rice farming, the newcomers to the archipelago also introduced metal to their new homeland by bringing the knowledge and technology for the creation of copper and bronze items. In particular, bronze swords, mirrors, and a unique kind of bell called a dotaku came to be seen widely in the Yayoi period, although they seem to have primarily been used as ceremonial items in religious festivals. The dotaku bells resemble a sort of flattened version of a modern Japanese temple bell, and were often inscribed with images related to the rice growing process, giving us further evidence of the ubiquity of rice cultivation during this era. We think that the people of the Yayoi period were more strongly religious than their Jomon forerunners, due to the massive influence which climate and weather had on the rice crop. With this new factor, religious faith in the gods of nature grew even stronger, and holding festivals and rituals to pray for an abundant harvest became an absolutely essential aspect of life. Last, but certainly not least, another cultural feature of the Yayoi period is the eponymous Yayoi pottery, which is distinct from its Jomon-era predecessor by nature of its reddish-brown color, lack of ornamentation, and the fact that it was thinner and yet more durable. This pottery was first discovered and identified by modern scholars in the Yayoi neighborhood of the Bunkyo ward of Tokyo in 1884, and this is where the period gets its name. With the cultivation of rice becoming ingrained in society throughout the Japanese archipelago, people began to band together and form larger and larger communities in order to make the labor-intensive farming process more efficient. The necessity for leaders naturally arose in these rapidly expanding communities, and Japan began to see its first ruling classes emerge throughout the island. With the appearance of these rulers, called Gozoku, and the new possibility for the storing and accumulation of food brought on by the rice revolution, differences in wealth among individuals first began to significantly form. Moreover, conflict between settlements began to break out, with the stronger settlements conquering the weaker ones and small states beginning to form. In the books I'm using, these settlements are referred to as mura, meaning village in modern Japanese, and the states are referred to as kuni, meaning country. But in both cases, hiragana is employed rather than kanji characters, subtly defining these mura and kuni as simpler and more archaic structures that ought to be understood as being distinct from their modern counterparts. Around the beginning of the 1st century CE, about 100 of these small kuni states existed on the archipelago, according to the Book of Han, a history of the former Han dynasty of China, completed in the year 111 CE. This is actually Japan's debut in written history, although it was obviously not referred to as Japan, but rather as Wakoku, the land of Wa, with this being the name for Japan that the Chinese used in this period. One of the many small kuni states, the kingdom of Nakoku, had sent a tribute to the Emperor Guangwu, Kobute in Japanese, of the later Han dynasty in the year 57 CE. In return, the king of Nakoku received a golden seal in recognition of his sovereignty over his kingdom from the emperor. This seal was lost for centuries, but it was rediscovered in Shikanoshima in modern Fukuoka Prefecture in 1784, and it bears an inscription from the Han court with the aforementioned recognition of sovereignty. One prime example of a Yayoi-era settlement equipped for the new demands of this militaristic age was the village whose vestiges remain at the Yoshinogari site in Saga Prefecture. Yoshinogari was what is known in Japanese as a kango shuraku, a fortified settlement surrounded by a palisade and a dry moat. Its moats were dug in a V shape and were about 6 meters across and 3.5 meters deep at the bottom of the V. The settlement also appears to have been equipped with watchtowers, monomiyagura, literally turret for looking at things, and defensive obstacles called sakamogi, sometimes called abati in English, which were stakes or sharpened tree branches stuck into the ground at an angle to prevent an enemy advance. This was an age where the stabilization of food production had ironically led humans to wage war with one another more ferociously than ever. They donned armor made of wooden plates, used large wooden shields which were placed on the ground rather than held in one's hand, and primarily wielded stone weapons until around 200 CE, when iron weapons finally began to become the norm. They fought over fertile land, water sources for rice paddies, and even just for stockpiled food to feed the ballooning population, particularly in times of drought or years with colder than usual summers. The ruins of Yoshinogari vividly illustrate the violent circumstances in which the people of this era lived, and indeed the headless skeleton whose photo I showed at the end of the previous video is a human remain excavated from the Yoshinogari site. In 220 CE, the Han dynasty fell as a result of peasant revolts, and China entered its Three Kingdoms period, wherein the kingdoms of Wei, Wu, and Shu, respectively Gi, Go, and Shoku in Japanese, vied for power. During the same century, the kingdom of Yamatai had come to prominence in Japan under the priestess queen Himiko, who had bent about 30 smaller kingdoms to her will and begun to bring peace to the land of Wa. She based her authority upon her alleged magic powers, with her policy decisions supposedly based on divination and messages from the gods. She is said to have remained cloistered deep in her palace at all times, never taking a husband, and meeting only with her younger brother, whose job was to pass on her decisions to her subjects. Our information about Himiko comes from the Wajinden section of the Gishi Chronicle, a historical record of the Wei Kingdom known in English as the Records of Wei, Account of Wajin. In the year 239 CE, Himiko is recorded as having sent an embassy to the Wei, and in return received 100 bronze mirrors and a golden seal, similar to the one the king of Nakoku received, proclaiming her as a friend of the Wei and ruler of the Wa. By the way, this year 239 is remembered by Japanese school children with the mnemonic Fumi kudasai ne Himiko yori, which literally means "send us a letter please" from Himiko. The fu is a possible reading for the number 2 in Japanese, for example, futatsu or futsuka. The mi is a reading for 3, mitsu, mikka, and the ku in kudasai is a possible reading for 9, such as in kugatsu. So altogether we get hu mi ku, 239, or in other words, the year 239. Another similar one is Himiko no fumikuru, gi no kuni e, or Himiko's letter comes to the kingdom of Wei. Probably not helpful mnemonics if you're not Japanese or pretty into the Japanese language, but interesting nonetheless. In addition to the record of Himiko's embassy, the records of Wei include a number of other facts about the government, society, and lifestyle of the people of Himiko's Yamatai kingdom. And as the Yayoi period Japanese did not yet have any system of writing, this information is crucial to our understanding of Japan in this era. They also include a description of how to reach the Yamatai kingdom from the Korean peninsula, but unfortunately, following this description literally leads one into the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and so scholars today are split regarding the actual historical location of the kingdom. The two most prominent theories are the Kyushu theory, which assumes the records of Wei to have made an error of distance, and the Kinki theory, which assumes an error in direction. Kinki, by the way, is the Japanese name for the central region of the archipelago, encompassing Kyoto and its surrounding provinces. It's basically a synonym for Kansai, and it's probably not heard much in English discussions of Japan for obvious reasons. Anyway, if the Kinki theory is correct, this would imply that there is some connection between the Yamatai kingdom and the Yamato kingdom that came to prominence in that area in the centuries immediately following. One piece of evidence backing this theory is the Makimuko site in Nara Prefecture, which is home to the remains of large buildings dating to about the same time as Himiko's reign. The site is also the location of the Hashihaka Kofun tumulus mound, the first such large-scale tumulus to be built in Japan, and a place believed by many to quite possibly be Himiko's tomb. The existence of the aforementioned Yoshinogari site, however, is viewed as strong evidence for the Kyushu theory, as despite the settlement predating Himiko's reign by a century or two, it shows conclusively that there were large-scale fortified settlements in that area during the period. Briefly going back to the Hashihaka Kofun tumulus, this story is not in the textbooks I'm using here, but the origin of the site's name is quite unique, to say the least. The tumulus is officially the burial site of the imperial princess Yamato Totohi Momosohime, daughter of the 7th Emperor of Japan, Emperor Kore. According to the Nihon Shoki, Japan's book of semi-mythical history, Princess Yamato Totohi Momosohime was married to the god Omono Nushi no Kami, but he refused to see her other than in the dead of night. Unhappy with this, she implored him to visit her in the light of day, and he obliged her by taking the form of a small snake and materializing inside her comb case. Not unsurprisingly, the princess was shocked at this and let out a scream, whereupon Omono Nushi no Kami became embarrassed and ran off into the mountains. Filled with regret, the princess attempted to sit down and weep over the situation, but she somehow managed to sit down on a pair of chopsticks, which stabbed her in the nether regions and caused her to die. The word for chopsticks in Japanese is hashi, and the word for grave is haka, so adding insult to injury, the unfortunate princess's burial place is known as Hashihaka, or so the story goes. This really is ancient mythology at its finest. Anyway, some theories suggest that Queen Himiko and the Princess Yamato Totohi Momosohime are in fact the same historical person, and it is also theorized that Himiko may in fact have been the legendary Empress Jingu, who attacked and defeated the Korean kingdom of Silla, or Shiragi, according to the Nihon Shoki Chronicle. The fact of the matter is, we don't even really know what Himiko's real name was in her homeland, as all of our information about her comes from Chinese records. Some suggest that the name Himiko derives from the Japanese word for sun, hi, and the word for priestess, miko, and that Himiko is thus just a way of saying priestess who serves the sun. It is also speculated that Himiko is a corruption of Himeko, which is another word for princess. After Himiko's death, the queen Iyo took over as ruler of Yamatai, and is recorded as having sent tribute to the emperor of the Jin dynasty. But following this, mentions of Wakoku disappear from the Chinese records. Around this time, the kingdom of Yamato was beginning its rise in the region around modern Nara, and the large tumuli that would define the next era were beginning to be built in earnest. With the story of the Yamato kingdom, we will really begin to take our first steps into the history of Japan as we know it, but that, I'm afraid, must wait until next time. If you're interested in reading a cool story set in the Yayoi period and featuring a fun interpretation of Queen Himiko, I highly recommend checking out the Dawn arc, Reimeihen, of Tezuka Osamu's manga series Phoenix, also known as Hinotori in Japanese. It's a classic series by a legendary mangaka, and it's even more fun when you go into it with a little background knowledge on the era. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and boom,